The sun dipped low behind the horizon, bleeding gold into the edges of the sky, and the house stood there as if it had been waiting for me to remember it. Its paint was peeling in thin strips, the wood groaned softly in the evening breeze, and the windows reflected a pale orange, like tired eyes holding back a story. I hadn't been here in decades, yet the moment I stepped onto the porch, every creak, every scent, every shadow felt familiar, as though the walls themselves exhaled in recognition. I ran my hand over the weathered railing, feeling the grooves worn smooth by 50 years of touch, and wondered how something I had poured so much of myself into could exist without anyone seeing the hands that built it. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed, not my children. I recognized the tone, the faint echo of someone else's life, but it carried into the yard with an ache I hadn't expected. The garden, once bright with marigolds and morning glories I had planted, had taken on a wildness I didn't recognize. It had grown tall and unruly, indifferent to the careful attention it had once received. The soil smelled different, heavier, as if it had absorbed decades of silence. Even the wind seemed hesitant, pausing as if listening. I remembered the mornings I had spent here, hands raw from cleaning, painting, planting, waiting for the family to notice. They never did, but the house remembered. I took a slow step inside. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight, greeting me like an old friend who remembered every misstep, every hurried shuffle, every barefoot dash across the hall in the dead of night. Dust particles floated in the fading light, tiny ghosts of my years spent keeping this place together, of mornings spent mopping tiles until the faint sheen shone, of nights spent sewing torn uniforms and patching holes in walls. I traced the walls with my fingertips, feeling the faint ridges left from paintbrushes long dry, remembering the sweat and the effort, remembering that I had raised this home in ways no one else acknowledged. Pictures lined the hallway walls, my children's faces, my husband's smile, grandparents who had come and gone, and yet in almost every photo I was absent, or nearly so, cropped out. Standing behind someone else, ghosted. Funny, isn't it? How a woman can be everywhere in a home and still disappear from its memory. I lingered in front of one frame, the glass dusty, reflecting a sliver of the evening light. I could see myself there, somewhere behind the children, my expression blurred and unimportant, my hands unseen. The air smelled faintly of polish, of damp wood, of years of work. My heart tightened. The house was whispering, not with voices, but with memory. Every corner, every beam, every stair carried the history of what I had done. I walked slowly, almost reverently, toward the kitchen. The smell of old spices and distant cooking teased the air. Someone had been here, moving through my spaces, yet no one had called my name, had not noticed the woman whose hands had repaired, painted, polished, lifted, built, and maintained these rooms for decades. I touched the edge of the countertop, feeling the chip in the marble where a pot had slipped through my fingers long ago. The memory of that night came rushing back, the fear, the clatter, the relief when nothing had been broken beyond repair, the small victory that only I had known. Under the stairs, I found the toolbox, the same blue metal box I had used for years, dented and rusted, its latch stubborn with age. Opening it released the faint metallic scent of iron and oil and time itself. Hammers, nails, screwdrivers, and a small wooden-handled knife rested inside, each tool a silent witness to decades of labor. I held the hammer, feeling the smooth weight settle in my hands as if it remembered the women's hands that had shaped it, the hands that had shaped the house itself. I ran my fingers over each tool, feeling pride, sorrow, and exhaustion swirl together. My fingers had built cupboards, repaired roofs, fixed doors, patched cracks. Yet no one remembered. The shadows lengthened, curling around corners and pooling in empty spaces. The house held its breath with me. Upstairs, life went on. My children spoke, laughed, tapped screens, closed doors, but none of it included me. The house seemed to hum, alive in ways the people who lived here had forgotten. I listened to the silence, the creaks, the whispers carried on the evening air. For a moment, I felt less alone. The house remembered. I remembered. I made my way to the hall mirror. My reflection looked tired, older. Lines had settled into my face that I didn't notice in the mirror at home. Gray strands had escaped my bun. My eyes, once sharp, had softened into careful observation as though they had learned to see the invisible. I traced a finger along the glass, and it trembled slightly. I remembered the mornings I had polished that mirror. The nights I had wiped it clean after tears, after frustration, after children's tantrums and husbands' absences. The light faded further. The wind stilled. Somewhere in the distance, a car drove by. I could hear the tires roll over the uneven street. I could smell the faint smoke from someone's chimney. And I could feel the weight of all those years pressing against me, all those moments unnoticed, all those hands that built this home, now erased from memory except by the walls themselves. I sank into the chair on the porch again, letting my hands rest on the wood, letting the house breathe with me. My throat ached in a quiet, wordless way. It was not anger. It was not sorrow alone. It was recognition. The home remembered me even if the family did not. It held my story in its beams, in the floorboards, in the corners I had polished until my hands bled, and I whispered softly into the cool evening air. I was here. I built this. A single crow cawed in the distance. The house exhaled. The wind carried faint echoes of my children's laughter, of footsteps long gone, of nights I had stayed awake patching leaks and painting walls. And though I was unseen, forgotten, dismissed, I felt a fragile sort of triumph. The house remembered, and that was enough. The front door groaned softly as I pushed it open, the hinges stiff with years of disuse. The smell of damp wood and old polish wrapped around me, a scent I thought I had forgotten. Dust motes floated lazily in the last rays of sunlight sneaking through the tall windows, moving like tiny ghosts across the floorboards I had walked on so many times before. My hand lingered on the doorknob longer than necessary, feeling the slight wobble of the metal, a reminder that nothing here stayed the same, and yet everything remained. I stepped inside slowly, bare feet brushing against the cool wooden floor. The creak beneath my weight was familiar. Each board had a memory, each whisper of sound a secret acknowledgement of my presence. I remembered the nights I tiptoed down these same hallways, carrying candles because the bulbs were too dim or had long burned out. I remembered sweeping the dust away each morning, watching the light catch on the polished surfaces, waiting for the family to wake, to notice, to see that I had kept this house alive. But they never did. And yet the house remembered. The walls were lined with photographs, some still framed, others left loose and faded. My children's faces stared back at me from decades past. Bright eyes, unruly hair, the innocence of a time I could no longer touch. And yet, as always, my own face was nearly absent. A blurred hand at the edge, a shadow in the background. I traced a finger across one of the photos, feeling the texture of the paper, the ridges of age. I could feel the warmth of my younger self in that space, the excitement of raising a home and a family with my own hands, and the weight of invisibility settling over me. I walked toward the kitchen, my steps deliberate. The tiles were cool underfoot, patterned with the faint stains of years of meals, spills, and hurried cleanup. I remembered kneeling here, scrubbing the floors until my hands were raw, while my children played or quarreled in the yard. I remembered the evenings I spent washing dishes, patching uniforms, sewing curtains, and keeping this home from falling apart when money, time, and energy all ran thin. I touched the edge of the counter, feeling a small nick where a knife had slipped once, and I smiled faintly at the memory. A small victory no one noticed but me. The cupboards held the faint smell of old spices and the faint tang of wood polish. I opened one, just enough to see the dishes, and a small envelope slid out from the corner. I bent to pick it up, feeling the slight crackle of paper aged by years. Inside were scraps of notes and faded photographs, some from birthdays, some from school projects, some I did not recognize. Each one was a piece of the life I had sustained here, unnoticed, unacknowledged. I felt the familiar ache rise in my chest, the slow, quiet ache that comes from giving and giving, without thanks or recognition, and realizing that perhaps no one will ever notice. I moved to the living room, brushing my hand along the back of the sofa. The fabric was threadbare in places I had not repaired, the cushions sagging where children had leapt and sprawled in decades past. I sank onto the worn seat, letting the weight of years settle on me. I closed my eyes and listened. The house spoke in quiet ways, a faint groan of the rafters, the whistle of wind through a poorly sealed window, the soft hum of a floorboard settling. It was alive with memory and history, and I was the only one attuned to its voice. From the window, I could see the garden. The roses I had planted as a young woman now grew wild, climbing haphazardly across trellises and fences. The marigolds had spread unchecked, and weeds sprouted through cracks in the walkway I had swept daily. The soil smelled of rain and earth, carrying the faint fragrance of flowers that no longer bloomed in their intended order. I walked to the back door barefoot, feeling the cold wood floorboard shift beneath my weight, listening to the faint, familiar crack as one of the steps flexed under me. Outside, the yard felt like a stranger. The swings I had installed for the children had rotted. The sandbox sat empty and cracked, and yet in the quiet I could almost hear their laughter, faint echoes drifting on the wind, brushing my cheek as if it remembered my touch. The memory made my throat tighten. I reached down and ran my fingers over the dirt, brushing away the leaves, imagining I could bring a small piece of the past back to life. Returning inside, I climbed the stairs carefully. The railing was smooth under my hand, polished by years of careful attention. I remembered sanding it, varnishing it, each stroke deliberate and full of hope that someone, anyone, would see the work I put into this home. Upstairs, the bedroom smelled faintly of linen and dust. I touched the door frames, the light switches, the walls, remembering all the nights I had patched holes, painted edges, and repaired the cracks that no one else noticed. In my own old bedroom, I found the small trunk I had hidden under the bed. Its lid protested with a faint squeak as I opened it. Inside were letters, scraps of cloth, childhood drawings, and the worn apron I had sewn countless times to protect my clothes during painting, gardening, and cleaning. Each item was a witness, a record of labor and love no one else acknowledged. I lifted a small photograph of myself as a young woman, hammer in hand, standing beside the half-built frame of the house. Next to me was a man, now long forgotten, who had once helped me. I ran a finger along the faded image, feeling the weight of memory, the ache of years unseen and unrecognized. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows. I shivered. Somewhere, deep within the house, I thought I heard a faint whisper. not human, but carried by the walls themselves. The house spoke, softly, urgently, like it remembered everything I had done. I sank to the floor, letting the memories wash over me. The evenings spent mending torn uniforms, the mornings of polishing and sweeping, the nights of worry and calculation to make sure there was always food and warmth. I realized, sitting there on the wooden floor with the fading light spilling across the room, that the house carried my story in ways no one else ever would. It held the proof of my hands, the evidence of my labor, the silent acknowledgement of my years. I could feel the walls leaning toward me, listening, remembering. And yet, I was alone in this recognition. My children might never see it. My husband might never say it. But the house knew. I rose slowly, moving toward the window that overlooked the street. I watched shadows lengthen as evening fell, the streetlights flickering on one by one. People passed by in distant cars, strangers who did not know the history beneath the roof they passed, and still the house exhaled quietly, holding the past, holding me. I whispered softly, almost to myself, I built this. I raised this. I carried this. The wind paused. A single leaf fluttered against the window, and in that silence, I realized something profound. Even if the world forgets, even if my family ignores the years I gave, even if my own face disappears from photographs, the house remembers. Corners like dust that refuse to move. I could feel the weight of the years pressing gently on my shoulders, not cruelly, not angrily, just heavily, like a presence that had been patient for decades. The sun had faded completely, leaving a muted gray in the sky, the kind of gray that reminds you how many things exist in shadows. I remembered the mornings when I would rise before the children, before the husband, before the world had even begun. I would sweep the floors, polish the windows, light the stove, and wash the dishes left from the night before. The smells of fresh bread, the faint tang of soap, the warm aroma of tea brewing, these were my morning prayers, my daily devotion to the house I raised. My hands bore the proof of every effort, rough from scrubbing, cracked from cold, scarred from tiny accidents that no one noticed. And yet, no one ever called me to acknowledge it. Walking slowly through the rooms, I traced my fingers over the edges of the furniture, feeling the grooves left by time and touch. Every chair, every table, every shelf held fragments of my life. I could almost hear the whispers of laughter, tiny footsteps padding across the wooden floor, the creak of my husband settling into his chair with a sigh of relief at the end of the day. I could see it all, smell it all, feel it in the tiny vibrations of the house beneath my feet. And yet, the rooms were empty. The family had grown and moved through life, leaving me alone with the echoes. I moved to the hallway and looked at the photographs on the walls. My children's faces smiled back at me from decades past, bright eyes full of curiosity, small hands holding toys or pencils. I remembered the evenings spent helping with homework, sewing patches on their uniforms, making sure they had enough to eat, enough to dream. My own face was almost always absent, relegated to the corners, or cropped out entirely. I felt a tug at my chest, a quiet sorrow that had no name. My presence in this house had been constant, invisible, essential, and yet unacknowledged. I found the old toolbox tucked beneath the stairs. Its surface was dented, scratched, and coated in the faint residue of decades of labor. Opening it, I saw hammers, nails, screws, sandpaper, a small brush, and other tools I had used to build, fix, and maintain every corner of this home. I ran my fingers over the smooth handles, remembering each moment, hammering in the early light, tightening loose screws in the dead of night, sanding rough edges until the wood shone. Pride and sorrow intertwined in my chest, a complex rhythm that reminded me of every sleepless night, every backache, every hand injury. I wondered, why had no one noticed? The wind whispered through the open window, carrying with it faint echoes of the past. Children's laughter, the clatter of dishes, the rustle of fabric as I sewed or mended. I closed my eyes and listened, letting the memories fill the space around me. The house was alive with the traces of all I had done, all I had given. It seemed to lean toward me in recognition, as though every creak, every shadow, every flicker of light knew me in a way my family no longer did. I walked barefoot into the kitchen. The tiles were cold beneath my feet, but the chill was comforting. I opened the cupboards one by one, remembering each meal prepared, each snack packed for the children, each careful consideration of what could be saved when money ran short. I lifted a small, worn envelope hidden behind a row of spices and found letters from my children when they were young. Some expressed love, some indifference, some hurried scrawls of gratitude, but all were now distant echoes. I held the letters against my chest, feeling the warmth of memory and the sharp ache of loss. The house seemed to hum around me, acknowledging the weight I had carried silently for decades. Moving toward the bedrooms, I paused at the door to my own room. The scent of lavender and old wood greeted me. I remembered nights spent awake, listening to the house settle, patching cracks in the walls, tending to leaks, ensuring every corner remained whole. I knelt and ran my hands along the floorboards, feeling the grooves and ridges worn by constant use. The effort of my life, of my labor, was etched into every beam, every tile, every stair. The house remembered what the people inside had forgotten. Upstairs, I opened the small trunk under my bed. Its lid protested with a faint squeak, releasing the faint scent of aged paper and fabric. Inside were letters, scraps of cloth, old photographs, and keepsakes from decades of family life. I lifted a photograph of myself holding a hammer beside the unfinished house frame. The man who had helped me standing beside me, his face almost forgotten. The image made my heart tighten. How had so many hands helped build this home? And yet the story had been lost, erased by the passage of time and the forgetfulness of the living. The shadows lengthened in the room as night approached. I sat on the floor, feeling the cool wood beneath me, listening to the house creak and settle. Memories of meals, laughter, tears, arguments, quiet moments, and labor all filled the space. Every corner, every beam, every crack held fragments of my life. I realized quietly and painfully that this house knew me better than anyone else. The house had absorbed every ounce of my effort, every sacrifice I had made, and it carried them silently, faithfully across decades. I stood and walked to the window overlooking the street. The street was quiet, almost abandoned. The trees swayed gently in the wind, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. Somewhere, distant voices carried in the night, the murmur of neighbors, children playing far away, but none of it included me. I was alone with the memory of my hands, my labor, my life in these walls. And yet there was solace in that recognition. I had given everything. I had built this home, raised this family, and though it might go unnoticed, the house remembered. I sank into the old chair by the window, letting my hands rest on the worn arm. Outside, the night deepened, and the world grew quiet. I could hear the faint creak of the roof, the whisper of wind through cracks I had patched, the gentle hum of a house that had lived and breathed with me. I whispered softly to the shadows, I was here. I built this. I carried this. The house answered in silence, acknowledging my presence in ways no one else ever had. and for a brief moment I allowed myself to feel proud, not for the acknowledgement of others, but for the quiet, steadfast knowledge that my hands, my effort, my love had left an indelible mark. The home, the silent witness of my life, remembered, and in remembering, it honored what the world had overlooked. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the curtains in fractured rays, falling unevenly across the floorboards I had polished years ago. I rose slowly, feeling the familiar stiffness in my knees, and walked toward the kitchen. The cupboards were as I had left them last night, the letters and scraps tucked carefully behind the spices, hidden from prying eyes. I picked one up, a small note from my daughter, folded neatly, words faded with age. I traced the letters with my finger, imagining the small hand that had pressed the ink onto the page, her innocence, her gratitude, some of it sincere, some overlooked, lay quiet in the folds of paper. I moved through the hallways with measured steps, each creak of the floorboards like a greeting, a whispered acknowledgement that the house knew me. Shadows stretched across the walls, cast by the morning sun, creating long lines that reminded me of my own hands reaching, grasping, building. I ran a hand along the railing of the stairs, remembering the nights I had scrubbed it until it gleamed, hoping that someone might notice, that someone might see the effort behind the labor, but noticing had never come. And yet the house remembered. Upstairs, I opened the small cupboard where I had hidden keepsakes, letters, and photographs. Each item carried a story. My husband's worn hat from his first job, scraps of fabric from clothes I had sewn, letters written in childish handwriting that sometimes praised my work, sometimes did not. I held each piece gently, as if the fragile paper could break under the weight of years, and felt the ache of time pressing against my chest. I realized the house was more than a home. It was a repository of my life, a silent witness to every sacrifice and moment of love no one else had acknowledged. I wandered into the living room and sat on the sofa, letting my hands rest on the cushions. The patterns of wear traced my fingers, the indents made by children, by my own hands, by the countless moments of labor. I remembered evenings spent mending, cleaning, cooking, and organizing, all while the world outside moved on without me. The house had absorbed everything, each creak a testament to years of effort, each shadow a memory I carried alone. And in that quiet, I felt the weight of invisibility settle again, mingling with pride and sorrow. I decided to visit Mrs. Farida, our old neighbor, hoping for a fragment of understanding, a hint that someone remembered what I had given. The path to her porch was lined with leaves, the wind carrying the faint scent of jasmine and dust. She was sweeping, her movements slow but deliberate, her eyes narrowing as she saw me approach. "Auntie Noor," she said softly, pausing mid-sweep. Her gaze flicked to the house behind me, and I could see recognition and hesitation dancing in her eyes. She had seen the years, the labor, the love, and she remembered. I spoke to her quietly, mentioning the letters, the hidden photographs, the small pieces of a life no one else seemed to notice. She did not smile, did not nod approvingly. Her silence carried weight, the kind that only comes from knowing truths too painful to say aloud. "Some stories," she murmured, "were buried for a reason. But you worked hard, more than they'll ever know." Her voice trembled, as if carrying decades of unspoken truths. I felt tears prick my eyes, but I held them back, letting the quiet acknowledgement fill the spaces the world had left empty. Returning home, I felt the familiar ache of isolation. The house seemed to lean in closer, its walls whispering faintly as if to say, "I remember. I see you." I ran my hands along the hallway, touching the frames of photographs, the edges of the doors, the grooves in the floorboards, and felt the imprint of my years etched into every surface. Each step I took was a conversation with memory, a dialogue between the present and the past, a silent recognition that even if no one else did, the house had never forgotten. I paused at the old dining table, tracing the scratches and dents I had made years ago while moving chairs, rearranging the room, or holding the hands of children learning to write. The table carried the weight of all the family meals, the whispered conversations, the quiet moments of worry and triumph. I remembered my husband's quiet sighs at night, the laughter of my children spilling across the room, and the nights I spent alone at the table, calculating, worrying, planning. Each mark on the wood was a testament to my presence, to my labor, to the invisible hands that had held this home together. A sudden draft stirred the curtains. Brushing against my cheek like a familiar hand, I followed the movement, stepping into the hallway where shadows lengthened across walls I had polished myself. The house seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with a memory of life long gone. I could hear faint whispers in the corners, the echoes of small footsteps, the gentle sighs of a husband, the laughter of children. I stopped, holding my breath, feeling the tension of decades, the subtle ache of unnoticed work, the quiet acknowledgement of a life spent sustaining others. In the kitchen, I found the locked cupboard I had hidden years ago. Inside were scraps of cloth, recipes, letters, and keepsakes, proof of countless nights spent awake, worrying, tending, laboring. Each piece was a fragment of memory, a testament to a life lived in quiet service. I traced the edges of the items with my fingers, feeling the weight of the years, the faint vibrations of love and sacrifice embedded in the fibers. I wondered, who would remember this work if I did not? Who would see the hands that built, repaired, and nurtured this home? As evening approached, the sky darkened with the promise of a storm. The wind rattled the windows, the first drops of rain pattering against the roof. I walked barefoot through the hall, feeling each creak, each dip, each imperfection in the floorboards. The house seemed alive, responding to my presence, whispering, "I remember." And I whispered back softly, "I am here. I am still here. I built this." Upstairs, I found an old photograph tucked beneath the bed, a younger version of myself holding a hammer beside the unfinished house frame. Next to me stood a man, now long forgotten, who had helped me once. The memory tightened around my heart, a mixture of pride, sorrow, and longing. Who else knew the truth of how this home was built? And why had it been erased from the memories of those I loved? I wandered through the rooms one last time, letting the storm drum on the roof above. Each floorboard creaked like a whispered confession. The walls leaned inward, as if acknowledging my years of labor, the silent sacrifices that had gone unseen. I felt a strange comfort in their recognition, a quiet understanding that even if my family never saw, even if the world forgot, the home remembered. Sitting on the porch as night settled, the wind tugging gently at my hair, I looked at the house one last time for the evening. Its windows reflected the dim light, shadows stretching like fingers across the walls. I whispered to the empty air, "I was here. I built this." And for a fleeting moment, I felt the weight lift, the acknowledgement of decades of labor, of love, of unspoken devotion. The house had witnessed it all. The storm had grown stronger by nightfall, rain lashing against the roof and windows, dripping through cracks I had patched decades ago. I walked barefoot through the hallways, feeling the uneven floorboards beneath me. Each step was a reminder of the years I had spent maintaining this house, preserving its walls, mending its leaks, and smoothing its imperfections. The house had absorbed every ounce of my effort, and now it seemed it was responding. The wind carried the echoes of memory, children laughing, dishes clattering, soft conversations that had once filled these rooms. I paused in front of the dining table, tracing the scratches and worn spots left by decades of use. My fingers lingered on the surface, and I could almost hear the conversations I had never joined, the moments I had quietly guided from behind the scenes. The weight of invisibility pressed down on me, heavier than the storm itself. Yet I felt a strange clarity, a knowing that the home itself remembered my labor, my sacrifices, and my presence. I whispered softly, "You remember, don't you? You remember everything." I climbed the stairs slowly, feeling the familiar pull of memories embedded in each step. In the hallway, I stopped at the locked cupboard I had discovered earlier. Its rusted latch protested as I opened it, revealing decades of letters, scraps of fabric, photographs and keepsakes. Each item held a story, a piece of my life that had gone unseen, unacknowledged, but never forgotten. My hands shook slightly as I lifted a photograph of my younger self, standing beside the unfinished frame of the house. Next to me, a man who had helped build the home, a presence long erased from family memory. The ache in my chest tightened. Who else had known? Who else had witnessed this story? I made my way to the front porch, letting the wind whip through my hair, the rain soaking my clothes. I called out softly to my children, though I knew they were far away, too busy with their lives to notice the house that had raised them. The words caught in my throat. I built this. I carried this for you. The emptiness of the street and the silence of the night echoed my loneliness, yet in that silence, I felt the house respond. Every beam, every floorboard, every shadow seemed to lean toward me in acknowledgement. Suddenly, a faint tapping echoed from the walls, rhythmic and persistent. I froze, heart quickening. It was a sound I had not heard in decades, a heartbeat of memory within the wood and plaster. The tapping led me to the corner of the hallway where a section of plaster had loosened. Carefully, I pried it away, revealing a hidden cavity. Inside lay tools I had used, gloves worn from years of labor, and the remnants of a small wooden frame. My fingers brushed the surfaces gently, reverently, feeling the history pressed into every splinter and dent. The house was speaking, showing me the story it had carried, the hands that had built it, the labor that had been forgotten. I sank to the floor, the rain drumming against the roof like a distant drumbeat. Tears blurred my vision, not from anger, not from frustration, but from a deep, aching recognition of my own life's work. I had labored silently, invisibly, but here in this house, my efforts were known, remembered. The storm outside seemed to echo my heartbeat, the house itself a living witness to decades of quiet sacrifice. I whispered again, I was here. I built this. Morning arrived slowly, the storm retreating and leaving the world washed clean in pale light. I sat on the porch, hands resting on the worn wood, feeling the texture of decades beneath my fingers. The house was quiet, serene, as if holding its breath. I watched the sun rise over the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard I had planted, nurtured, and tended. Memories rose like mist, laughter, tears, sleepless nights, and moments of silent devotion. The house held them all, and for the first time I felt a fragile peace. I thought of my children and their indifference, their failure to recognize the labor of my hands, the years I had devoted to their upbringing, the home I had built for them. I knew they might never fully understand, might never truly see the sacrifices that shaped the walls around them. But the house did. Its beams, floors, and plaster carried the story of my life, a story that no one could erase. And in that knowledge, I felt a quiet triumph. The old neighbor, Mrs. Farida, had been right. Some stories are buried, overlooked, and forgotten. But not all memory relies on human acknowledgement. The house itself, alive with my history, bore witness to my presence. I traced my fingers along the porch railing, weathered by decades of sun, rain, and touch. I whispered a soft apology to the empty air, an acknowledgement that perhaps no one else would ever speak, but that I had lived, labored, and loved in these walls. I walked through the hallways one final time, each step deliberate, each creak of the floorboards a gentle acknowledgement. Shadows stretched across the walls, bending and leaning as if in recognition. I felt the house pulse beneath my feet, the heartbeat of decades woven into wood, plaster, and stone. Every nook and corner held evidence of labor, devotion, and quiet sacrifice. The house had absorbed everything I had given, and now it held it as a sacred memory. Sitting at the old dining table, I allowed myself a small smile. Tears slid down my cheeks, not from sorrow, but from relief. The house remembered. My efforts, my life, my love, and my labor were preserved within its walls. Even if my family forgot, even if the world overlooked, this home would never betray the story of the hands that raised it. I rose and moved to the porch once more. Dawn light spilled across the yard, soft and forgiving. The storm had passed, leaving the world bright and quiet. I let the wind brush against my face, felt the smooth grain of the wood beneath my fingers, and breathed in the smell of wet earth and polished wood. I whispered softly, I was here. I built this. And for the first time in decades, I felt my legacy settle, quiet and strong, within the walls of the home that had always known me. The house was no longer silent. It hummed with the memory of decades, with the presence of hands that had labored unseen, with the echoes of a life dedicated to care and creation. And as I stepped back, letting the light wash over me, I realized the world may forget, families may overlook, and stories may fade, but some memories endure. Some stories are held in wood, in plaster, in the very air of a home, and mine would endure long after I was gone. The wind paused as if listening. The house leaned slightly, shadow stretching toward me in quiet acknowledgement. I took a deep breath and whispered once more, I was here. I built this. And in that moment, I felt a profound peace. The hands that had raised this home, though forgotten by others, were honored, remembered, and immortalized in the very walls I had loved for a lifetime. Thank you for watching. Your time and support truly mean a lot. If you enjoyed this content, please like, share, and subscribe. It helps the channel grow and allows me to bring you even better videos. Stay inspired, stay focused, and I'll see you in the next video.